little darkness goes a long way.
I'm a middle-aged woman, just for context. Back when I was in my mid-20s in 2004, I worked at a private childcare facility. We were just starting out as a new business and we'd only been open for a few months. I only had one other co-worker in the beginning, since we just had a few kids enrolled so far. At first, nothing seemed amiss. Several months went by and I was there from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m, Monday through Friday. I spent a lot of hours in this building and quickly became familiar with its various unique noises, the way all houses have. The building itself was basically just a small house that had been slightly remodeled to accommodate our needs, primarily childcare classrooms. It was not even very old, maybe 40 years or so. One thing you do need to know about me is that I'm very skeptical. I rule out every possible explanation before I even consider paranormal stuff may be happening. I've had plenty of paranormal experiences in the past. I know what they feel like. They were not frightening, and I'd been very lucky to just coexist with benign ghosts growing up. Anyway, the first thing that happened was, after being employed for about 6 months, I came in a little before 6 a.m. to get things started for the day, before parents showed up with their kids. I'd been doing this since day one. However, when I walked through another classroom meant for 2-year-olds on the way to my room, there was a crayon box on the floor. It was open and the crayons were scattered everywhere. I thought it was strange, but whatever. I just picked them up and put them back on the shelf. No big deal. I figured maybe they just slid off because I had not put them up properly the previous day when I had used them to make some holiday decorations for the room. The kids I took care of were infants, aged 6 weeks to 1 year old. This is how I knew that all the kids were not making the weird things happen, because they were too young and physically incapable of doing almost anything on their own. We didn't have any 2-year-old kids enrolled yet either, so that classroom wasn't even being used. A couple more days went by and nothing else happened, and I mostly forgot about the crayons. Then, that Friday I came in at 6 a.m. as usual, and there, the box of crayons were on the floor again. This time, however, they didn't look like they had merely fallen off the shelf. Now the crayons were all the way across the room, like they had been thrown there. I was becoming suspicious that perhaps my co-worker/boss was playing a trick on me, but that really isn't her style. She's a no-nonsense type person, and denied even being in those rooms when I asked her about it. So while I was cleaning up all the crayons near the wall where the crayon box had landed, I noticed there was a small dent in the green paint. Was this where the crayon box had hit the wall before landing on the floor? My boss would never purposely dent the wall. She's very adamant that things look pristine. I checked the crayon box for clues as well, but it told me nothing. Knowing I couldn't do anything about this, I went on with my day, caring for the babies, and nothing else unusual happened. In the coming weeks, cleaning up the crayon mess became a normal part of my morning. I jokingly told my boss we must have a little poltergeist who liked to play pranks, and I'd nicknamed it Pierre. This was stupid of me because from then on, the activity became much more frequent. It was as if now that I had acknowledged its presence, it craved more attention. This was one of the reasons that made me consider that this was not really a ghost. It didn't give me the same feeling as a ghost did, either. It felt different, in the way the presence of a wild animal feels different than a domesticated pet. Still, I'm not easily intimidated, and I was determined not to let it bother me. I went on with my work every day, caring for and becoming familiar with each child's habits. When a couple of the children turned 2, we decided I could use both classrooms to have a bigger play area for the toddlers who could walk. It was safe to do so since there was nowhere for them to be out of my sight. The rooms were only separated by a very small wall and a low gate. In this new classroom, I had to train the 2-year-olds to sleep on padded mats instead of in cribs during nap time. I sat with them while they fell asleep and would then eat my lunch and read or write while they slept. One day, one of the kids kept looking at the ceiling instead of falling asleep like usual. There was nothing interesting about our ceiling at all, just a plain white space. But her eyes were following something around, and I didn't see a thing. She took her little hand out from under her blanket and pointed upward, but didn't say anything, because I doubt she had the vocabulary to explain what she was seeing. I reassured her and she eventually fell asleep. But the next day, the same thing happened, and her eyes followed whatever it was around, until she was looking at the wall where a clipboard was hanging on a tack on the wall. The clipboard began to sway back and forth, slowly at first, then gaining momentum, until it was swinging hard enough to fall off the tack and onto the floor. It didn't make too much noise since it had fallen onto carpet, but it was very strange to see. There was no heating or air conditioning on, and no windows were open to create any kind of airflow. None of the wall decorations made any movement either. I whispered out loud, "Pierre, the kids are trying to sleep. Can you knock it off, please?" In a matter of seconds, the room suddenly felt different, less dim somehow, as though the poltergeist had left. Nothing else happened the rest of the day, or even the next day. But after that, the crayon box mess was still happening. 2 of the kids were now watching the ceiling more frequently. The clipboard would sway but not fall off. And now, some of the toys with batteries would come on by themselves and wake the kids up earlier than they should have. Even some of the toys in the toy box that were not battery operated were shifting in the box, and no one was near it. I was not pleased. I took the batteries out of the loudest toys during nap time to prevent some of the noise. No one messes with kids under my care, and I told Pierre this. Now, all the activity had become focused on me personally instead. My things would be misplaced, and I'd find them in the weirdest areas that I know I would have never had them. I put up with all this aggression so as not to frighten the kids. But it was becoming very annoying. For whatever reason, I've been blessed with an almost endless patience, so I just endured everything. But when Pierre started throwing things, I got pissed off. The first thing he threw was a small toy which hit me in the back of my arm. It didn't hurt, and I just figured one of the kids threw it and turned around to say that throwing things wasn't allowed. But then I saw that the toy was from a set of puzzles on a shelf the kids couldn't reach on their own, same as the crayons. I grumbled about it but didn't make a fuss. This didn't seem to be enough for Pierre. It was like he wanted me to be afraid of him, and the next day he knocked a glass jar of baby food off another shelf. It didn't break since it was so small and fell on carpet, but I didn't like it because if one of the kids had been nearby, it might have hit them in the head, and who was going to believe me if I said a poltergeist had dented their child's head with a jar of baby food? I didn't want to lose my job and be accused of child abuse. The day after that, I opened a jar of baby food and prepared to feed it to one of the littlest ones. Then I realized I forgot a washcloth to help with the inevitable mess and put the open jar on a shelf behind me. This was very stupid of me as well. I crossed the room, and stopped on my way back over to help another child with something. As soon as I crouched down, that open jar of baby food hit me right in the middle of my back, leaving a big orange splatter of sweet potatoes across my shirt. It was definitely enough to startle me at first because, once again, none of the kids could have done it since the jar was on a shelf far above their heads. But again, I'm stubborn and don't back down from a challenge, especially when the safety of children is at stake. My biggest fear was that one of the kids would get hurt. I told my boss about it, but I wasn't sure she believed all the things were really happening. She had not seen any of it since she was on the other side of the building taking care of the older kids. We weren't sure what to do about any of it. What could we do? We never said anything to the parents because we didn't want to risk looking like lunatics, unable to care for their children. The last straw came the next week. The laundry room in the building separated the two halves of classrooms and had doors on either side of it, so it was accessible to both me and my boss. She came through the door on her side to bring me something, and I went to the door on my side. Next to my door, there was a set of shelves that held supplies. On the highest shelf above my head, an unopened jug of apple juice came sliding across the shelf from where it had been against the wall. I heard it but didn't understand what I was hearing until this jug of juice landed right on my head. My boss just stopped talking and stared at me with big eyes. It was like she was frozen in place. The juice hit the floor and broke open, spilling everywhere and soaking the carpet. I couldn't even try to catch the jug because I was still reeling from being hit in the head with something so heavy. I came to my senses a few seconds later, hearing my boss ask me if I was alright. I was okay for the most part, but had a headache now for obvious reasons. The kids were all staring at me, having heard the big noise and me saying "ow" pretty loudly. I pretended I was fine, so as not to scare them, but in truth, I was beginning to be just a little afraid. More than that though, I was pissed off. Like, really, truly angry, which is unusual for me. The rest of the day went on normally enough, and I assured my boss I was fine. She finally did believe me for real now, and she had seen this happen with her own eyes. I told her I was going to stay after work for a little bit and clean the carpet more thoroughly. She said it was okay and she'd see me tomorrow. I got the feeling she did not want to stay. I waited until everyone was gone, and I walked my boss to the door, locking it behind her as she left. Now the building was eerily quiet, but I had business to attend to. I refused to be afraid to come to work every day. I had bills to pay. Not only that, but my sister had just found out she was pregnant and would be bringing her baby to the childcare facility for me to look after when the time came. No way was I having a poltergeist terrorizing me while I was caring for another newborn. So I went back to my classroom, where the stain on the floor looked sort of like the shape of a goat's head. I would have taken a picture, but this was before every cell phone had a camera in it, and my little grey Nokia didn't have one. I sprinkled some stuff on the floor to soak up more of the liquid, then vacuumed it up. When I was done, I told Pierre I had something to say, and he had better listen. I told him I was sick of his shit, and if he wanted to stay here, he had to straighten up and lose the attitude, or I was going to find a way to have him removed. I still don't know what I was actually going to do to follow through on that threat, but he didn't need to know that. I also told him that he was not going to scare me away, and that if he wanted attention, he could find a much less destructive way to do it, and we could coexist and get along. Then, I packed my stuff up and went home, feeling better now than I had let off some steam. The next day, There were no crayons on the floor. There were multiple tiny dents on the wall by this point, from where the crayon boxes kept hitting the wall repeatedly. I felt a tiny bit of hope that maybe I had gotten through to Pierre. I didn't feel his presence through the morning or afternoon, and none of the kids seemed to know anything I couldn't see. After the last kid was gone and I was packing up and getting ready to leave, I couldn't find my keys. They weren't in the normal spot I kept them, which was on yet another shelf with my purse. I looked all over and finally found the keys underneath one of the cribs. This was the last thing of mine that went missing for a few weeks. After that, only small, inconsequential items would go missing and turn up in strange places, and not very often. It seemed like Pierre was just being playful now, instead of being a total asshole. I could definitely live with this kind of poltergeist behavior. The last thing to add to this story, we found out later on that at one point before our childcare business occupied the building, it had been the site of an illegal, high-stakes gambling ring. Had this kind of activity left behind a residual energy that manifested into a poltergeist? It's impossible to know for sure, but I thought it was worth a mention. Thanks for listening. Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. A huge thank you to Sarah with an H for submitting this story to me to read on my channel. It really was an eerie story, and I enjoyed it so much. If you want to help support this channel, you will find links to both my Patreon and my Teespring store in the description below, so feel free to have a look. As always, a big thank you to all of the Reddit users who kindly allowed me to use their stories, and the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. I truly do appreciate it. And remember,
Papa love.